Welcome, everybody. I'm John Moss with the National Museum of the U.S. Army. And tonight I'm glad to be able to welcome you here, especially for a subject and book near and dear to my heart. This is a great new book on the Revolutionary War, and it's called Liberty is Sweet, The Hidden History of the American Revolution by Dr. Woody Holton. So we're going to get started here. I want to introduce Dr. Holton to our program and tell you a little bit about him. He is McCausland Professor of History at the University of South Carolina, where he teaches and researches early American history, especially the American Revolution, with a focus on economic history and on African Americans, Native Americans, and women. He is the author of several previous books, including Abigail Adams, which was awarded the Bancroft Prize. Another one called Forced Founders, which was the first book of his I read and enjoyed very much, which is one of the reasons I started thinking about asking him to participate in a program. He was also at the University of Richmond for a number of years and is a native Virginian. So, Dr. Holton, welcome. A very good evening to you. We're glad to have you.
Well, I thank you very much, John. I'm going to share my screen now because I have some slides with me. And as I'm doing that, I know that many of the people watching tonight themselves served in the Army or one of the other service branches, and especially what we're watching in Ukraine reminds the rest of us to be so grateful to those of you who did that. And I'm grateful for Dr. Moss's invitation because it's my chance to talk about the military conflict. I've been thumping my book all over the country, mostly virtually, and people want to hear about the political aspects and this and that. But I'm thinking the Army Museum, if anybody, the National Museum of the United States Army, if anybody, is going to be the one that's going to let me talk about the military conflict. And so that will be my focus tonight. Can't do the whole thing, of course. So I'm just going to pick three, what I think are crucial years. And really, especially with 1763 and 1775, I want to focus on the British Army and its role in bringing about the war that is causing the American Revolution, and then its role in the early fighting, specifically in 1775, because I think that set the pattern in many ways that lasted throughout the war. And then we can't not talk about 1781, so I'll wrap up there. Well, the reason I picked 1763 to start is multiple. Many of you know that's the year that the British North America, along with Britain, won the war against France that we call the 7 Years' War. Yes, it was a big victory for the British and the Americans, but it nearly doubled the British debt because, of course, the most expensive thing governments ever do is go to war. And so Britain was determined not to further increase its debt and studied how can we stop losing so much money in America. You've heard of the Stamp Act, and a lot of people think the purpose of the Stamp Act was to get some money out of America to pay off that debt from the 7 Years' War, but that's not actually true. But there is a connection, and that's the connection I want to draw tonight using what I think is this very cool map of the drawn up by the British Army officials of cantonments. So the big red rectangles are regiments, the smaller ones are companies. And here's the other reason that 1763 is so significant is that the British government, trying to cut expenses in America, actually increased their expenditures in America in a crucial way. And that was by leaving 10,000 British troops in America, even though in 1763, the war was over. So really, we should call these peacekeeping troops. The majority of them, as you can see, were stationed in places like Quebec, which the British had just conquered, and really out on the frontier. You see my pointer is pointing to Niagara, and we could go out to Detroit, or you're still on the frontier when you're at Fort Pitt, that's now Pittsburgh, and some down in South Carolina where I live, and as far out as the Mississippi River. these British soldiers were left, A, to protect the colonists from the Native Americans, but also, surprisingly, to protect Native Americans from colonists. Now, not because the British government had suddenly become humanitarian in its attitude towards indigenous people, but to try to stop the colonists from doing things to the Native Americans that provoked them to war. So that's why I think it's fair to refer to these as peacekeeping troops. 10,000 soldiers left in America, according to a decision made by the British Parliament in 1763. And to enforce that border, especially after Indians rebelled, you've heard of Pontiac's Rebellion, to enforce that border, they drew a line that I've just drawn here in blue, the Proclamation line of 1763, to keep colonists, to try to keep colonists and Native Americans apart. So the Proclamation line itself was a big grievance for many of the colonists because they wanted to expand west, some as settlers and others as land speculators. Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and almost every other patriot leader that you can name had, during the colonial period, invested in Western land. And now that's all cut off by the blue line that I drew there. So you can see why that shows up in the Declaration of Independence as a grievance. But this issue of the West also is really what gives us the Stamp Act, that first major tax that Britain tried to levy on the colonists, that is in 1765, because the purpose of the Stamp Act was not to raise money to pay off the war debt. The purpose of the Stamp Act was to pay for these cantonments of troops that you see on this British map. And since those troops were there primarily to keep Indians or Native Americans and colonists apart, since that was their primary mission, there's a real sense in which you could say, had there been no Indians, then Parliament would never have felt the need to adopt the Stamp Act. And I mentioned that first to illustrate a major theme of my book, that most recent books will at least have a chapter about Native Americans and a chapter on African Americans, chapter on women, and so forth. But what I thought was so important to do in my own book, Liberty is Sweet, is to integrate all of those stories, because of course, Native American history happened at the same time as African American and diplomatic and military history, and they massively influence each other, as you see in this example, where I would go so far as to say, and we can argue this out in Q&A, I'll finish by 7:45 for that, but I would go so far as to say, had there been no Native Americans, there would have been no Stamp Act. Well, Native Americans continued to influence the British after the Stamp Act in 1765. The colonists wanted to repeal that blue line, the Proclamation line that I showed you. And guess who prevented that from happening, or took the lead in doing so? I've given you a second to get oriented to this modern map, Chicago at the top, St. Louis, south of Chicago, of course, Louisville. I'm going to zoom in now to the Wabash River, that's now in part the line between Indiana and Illinois. And why am I going way out there? Because the female peace chiefs living on the Wabash River in 1769 sent wampum belts, these colored beaded belts, to their counterparts, that is women leaders and later also male leaders, at Native American nations all through the Midwest and even in the South, saying, hey, the British drew that blue line, the Proclamation line, but many colonists are violating it. And so all of us Native Americans need to come together to resist the colonists. And the British government found out about this coalition that was coming together out in what's now Ohio and the neighboring states. And the British government decided to stick by that blue line, the Proclamation line. And so here again, Native American women in this case are influencing the policies of the British government in a way that was really adverse to colonists like Washington and Jefferson and Franklin, and it becomes one of the many reasons, along with the Stamp Act that I've already mentioned and others that I won't have time to mention tonight, that we get the Revolutionary War. And it all began with the British government trying to keep British troops out of combat because that was what was so expensive for the government to pay for. And I just want to follow, I'm still in 1763. As you see, I've cheated forward to 1769. I'm going to cheat a little bit further forward into the Revolutionary War, because I'm not going to have time to say a lot about Native American participation in the war. But I do want to say that in the West, there's a real sense in which these indigenous warriors won the war. They kept the colonists in places like Kentucky, that was then part of Virginia, or Western Pennsylvania, Western New York. The native attackers kept the colonists really back on their heels. And where you really see it is at Detroit. Oh, Detroit has wandered away from its bearings on my map. I apologize for that. If you guys know where it really is, I'm not sure why my blue star moved away. But here's the point. I'm going to take it off because I can't stand it being up there in the wrong place. I'll put my arrow there instead. The number one objective of the Continental Army, that is the US Army, in the West throughout the war was to capture Detroit. That's because it was the British fort where they handed out guns and ammunition to these native warriors who would leave Detroit and go attack Western New York or Western Pennsylvania, as far south as South Carolina. And the people like George Washington understood that the Native Americans were wholly dependent on the British for guns and ammunition. So they figured if we can cut off their supply of weapons, then we can stop the native attack. So you can see why the various officers in the Continental Army made a dozen different plans over the course of the war to capture Detroit. But the amazing thing I want to tell you, given kind of the bad press that Native Americans have as being people to be pitied, the amazing fact is that none of these 12 efforts to capture Detroit on the part of the Americans, none of those attacks ever got anywhere near Detroit because of those same Native Americans resisting those efforts. So there's a real sense in which the Native Americans won the war in the West, and all they lost was lost at the bargaining table, where they weren't represented in 1783 when the rebel colonists got their independence and signed a treaty with the British. The British totally sold out the Indians and said, oh yeah, you can, said to the United States, oh yeah, you can have all the land out to the Mississippi. Native Americans didn't go for that, went on to resist. And that's what George Washington spent a lot of time dealing with in his first, in his 2 administrations as president. So that was my quick take on 1763, the pivot point between the previous war against France. In a way, the way that war came out, such a great victory for the British, but not wanting another war, they adopted policies like the Proclamation Line and leaving all those troops there and adopting the Stamp Act to pay for the troops. All of those help in turn bring on the Revolutionary War, in which Native Americans would also play a big role. So now let's jump all the way to 1775. And you can imagine, I can't resist mentioning the battles of Lexington and blue there, and Concord in the red rectangle. This is Eastern Massachusetts, a map done by a British Army officer in 1775. And what I really want to zero in on, though, is the town of Boston, which in those days was almost an island. It's tiny little bit of land, and actually sometimes this would flood and make it a literal island. And I'd love to talk more, and we can during Q&A if you want. The one thing I can't resist saying that I discovered researching my book was an accusation, not proof, but an accusation by a British officer that among the Americans who fired at the British troops as they stumbled back all the way from Concord, back through Lexington, and over to Charlestown on their way back to Boston, that among the people who fired on them was at least one woman. And I'd never seen that accusation before, so I make it prominent in the book. But the battle I really want to talk about is the Battle of Bunker Hill on June 17th, 1775. Boston's a peninsula. We'll talk later about the Dorchester Peninsula below Boston, but here above, north of Boston, is the Charlestown Peninsula. And the Americans fortified what was supposed to be Bunker Hill, and that's why we call it that, but was actually the person in charge. We're not even sure who made the decision, but the person in charge decided to put those cannon and build breastworks and a redoubt on Breed's Hill. And you may not care, oh, Bunker, Breed's, who cares? Well, the British cared because Breed's Hill, where they actually established that fort, was within cannon range of the British who controlled Boston at the time. So the British felt they had to go on June 17th, 1775 to go capture Bunker Hill. They did that. This is a modern depiction of the American redoubts, and the British took them 3 tries, but they did capture Bunker Hill under the leadership of William Howe. So that became a British hill on June 1775. But the big but here is that General Howe, who was the hero of that battle, came out of it depressed because he suffered 50% casualties, and he witnessed what the Americans did once they had to retreat from Breed's Hill. They just retreated back to the next hill, Winter Hill, in Cambridge. And he realized, he wrote a letter just 3 days after the Battle of Bunker Hill saying, this is the very start of the Revolutionary War. You know, the Americans won't even declare independence for another year. But General Howe, who was not yet the commander-in-chief of the British forces, but soon would be, he wrote this letter 3 days after Bunker Hill saying, we, the British, are going to lose this war. He just had this great victory. Everybody's carrying him around on their shoulders as the hero of the battle. But he said, 50% casualties capturing this hill. The Americans moved back to the next hill. They're going to charge us the same price for that hill. And then they'll move to the third hill, on and on. And so he had this amazing perception that the war was unwinnable for the British right from the start. And that's because the Americans could keep going back to hills, and also because the real tool that won the war for the Americans was not bayonets like muskets like those you see depicted here, or rifles, the famous rifles. It was the shovel, and you could really see it depicted here. They had the honor and the privilege, really, of fighting on defense and in 18th century battles, unless the defenders really screwed up, like the people charged with defending Trenton on December 26, 1776. Unless the defenders really goofed, the defense had an automatic tremendous advantage. And many of you know that that would be true in the Civil War and World War I. And it remains it's one of the reasons that the Ukrainians, we all admire their amazing courage, but they have a natural advantage in playing defense, even in modern warfare, not as much as them. And so there's a line in Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton about the Continental Army being an army in need of a shower. But that's how they won the war, is that they spent their time digging dirt and turning flatland into trenches and breastworks. And that's really what won them the war, I think, more than anything else. And here's where I'm going to lay down a really controversial comment that I hope people will disagree with at 7:45, and that is, I agree with General Howe. The war was unwinnable for the British. We think of the Americans as the underdogs, David fighting Goliath, but remember, David beat Goliath, and there's a real sense, and this is not to in any way gainsay the amazing deprivation and sacrifices that the Americans would have to go through during those 7 years from 1775 through 1782, but in a sense, it was really their war to win. And I'll come back to that in just a minute. But I want to talk a little bit about another huge event of 1775, and that is African Americans spent that entire year appealing to the British, saying, if you will free us, we will fight on your side. And that was a pretty appealing argument to the British because there were many more patriots than loyalists. Loyalists were really strong in the South Carolina backcountry where I live today, and in New Jersey and out on Long Island. There were pockets of really a lot of loyalists, but overall, probably twice as many patriots, if not more. And so the British governors and generals, they needed warriors, and African Americans like this man who fought in the British Army, actually he's fighting over in Europe and on the European theater of the Revolutionary War. But they made this offer, and despite their tremendous need, the British turned them away and talked about it and hemmed and hawed, but eventually, finally, listened to the appeals of African Americans. And on November 15th, 1775, the governor of Virginia issued an Emancipation Proclamation that was different from Lincoln's, but it had a lot in common with Lincoln's. And it said, if you're a slave and you're owned by one of the rebels, meaning people that we call patriots like Jefferson and Washington, and then the biggest if was, if you can get to my lines, then I will enlist you in the British Army and pay you for your service by freeing you. And thousands of African Americans took them up on that offer. That infuriated white colonists, and I think it's one reason in the South why so many white people who had been hemming and hawing about whether to declare independence. So you see, when Dunmore issued a proclamation in November of 1775, the war had been on in New England for 6 months already, but independence wouldn't come for another 8 months. And we have a big debate about what converted white Southerners to supporting independence. And Thomas Paine's Common Sense, that came out in January 1776. That sure helped. But one of the biggest thing was the anger. And I put my hands together as a symbol of an alliance. It wasn't a written down alliance between African Americans and British, but there was an informal alliance between them that really infuriated whites and helped push many over into declaring independence. And you can see that in the list of grievances. The one that they kind of saved the best for last was the Congress's denunciation of the British for he has excited domestic insurrection amongst us. That is, he's turned our slaves against us, as they would see it. And so African Americans, like Native Americans, played a big role in bringing about the war, but then also in fighting it. And unfortunately, I only have one time for one example of this. And I'm cheating again, moving away from 1775, just going forward to a battle that took place near my home in Savannah, Georgia. You might remember that Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell was charged with 3,000 troops to go capture. He was a British lieutenant colonel, light colonel, going down to capture Savannah at the end of 1778. He had 3,000 men. The Americans only had less than 1,000. And so that's enough, but look how the Americans had lined up. Campbell actually climbed a tree to review the American defenses and was just distraught at what he saw, because they had managed to anchor both of their flanks. And a frontal assault is always the most painful kind for the attacker. And they were going to force him to attack them frontally by anchoring their flanks, both of their flanks, in swamps. But Campbell knew what he had to do, so he got prepared to launch his frontal assault. But then a black man, a slave named Quamina Dolly, came up to Lieutenant Colonel Campbell and said, "You don't have to attack frontally. I know, because I'm from here, of a path through the swamp." And I'll follow with my cursor here this dotted line from Campbell, where you not only can attack the Americans from the flank, armies are weak on their flanks, but even better, you can get behind the American army. And Colonel Campbell took that advice and took his light infantry around and attacked the American side from behind, creating absolute disorder within the American army. They quickly withdrew, and many were captured, and that was the end of that was the Battle of Savannah, with hardly any British casualties. Would have been a completely different battle if it hadn't been for Kwame Dali. And I'd be happy to talk in Q&A about other examples, but I'll just use that one, throw that one out as one example. Well, staying in 1775, I want to bring George Washington onto the scene, because it was on July 3rd, 1775, that he took charge of this new thing called the Continental Army. British were in Boston, as I mentioned, so he's going to be stationed out at Cambridge, right outside the gates of Harvard College. And Washington arrived with his natural, but also learned from being an elite member himself of the British Empire, and read all the books from London and so forth, and imbibed that British culture, served, of course, in the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. And he came with the attitude that the noble thing to do, the thing that wins wars, is to go on offense. And so Washington had not been with the Continental Army out at Cambridge more than a couple of months before he was trying to find ways of attacking Boston. That's going to be hard because the British control the water, and you've got this tiny little isthmus, and they built up triple, quadruple. I've seen other maps that show you the emplacements of cannon that which they'd be firing grape shots like a giant shotgun at these soldiers. This was going to be mass casualties on the part of the Americans, but Washington was bent on doing that. But to his credit, he allowed his generals to keep talking him out of that until we get to March 1776. And I'm going to zoom in on Dorchester Heights, because you all know that he famously occupied Dorchester Neck, just south of Boston, the heights there, and started putting up cannon there to capture, to drive the British out of Boston. Now, the story that's in all the history books is great success for Washington. They actually gave him an honorary degree at Harvard, and John Hancock had commissioned a painting of him, which I think I have a copy of his. There it is, by Charles Wilson Peale. This is celebrated as Washington's first big victory. And I have to see it that way too, but Washington didn't. His description of his attitude after he put those troops on Dorchester Heights, March 4th and 5th, the British finally left today, actually, March 17th of 1776. You'd think he'd be elated as well, but why did he say disappointment? Because what really happened, as you and I know, is that the British, I'm going to give you the same map 3 times. What really happened is the British the Americans occupied Dorchester Heights, and then the British skedaddled. Took them 2 weeks to do so, but they left. So why was Washington not satisfied with that? Well, let me tell you first that his generals weren't satisfied with that either, because they had a different purpose in occupying Dorchester Heights, which I will show you. Get my cursor back. Here's what his Council of War wanted. They wanted to be attacked because many of them had been present for the Battle of Bunker Hill the previous June, and they saw those 50% casualties, and they wanted to do that to the British again. So they basically put those troops, American troops, on Dorchester Heights as bait, so that the British would feel like they had to come up Dorchester Heights so that they wouldn't have Americans within cannon range of their southern defenses. They'd have to come up, and yes, the Americans would run away at some point, but they'd cause the British 50% casualties first. I actually think that was a great plan. But here's where George Washington was new, and he was aggressive, and he said to the council, well, that's a great plan, but I want to amend it a little bit. I almost think of Michael Scott in The Office saying, oh, okay, great plan, but let me add one thing. Here's what he added. Okay, we will occupy Dorchester Heights, That will cause General Howe, who's now the commander-in-chief of the British forces, that will cause him to send half of his army out of Boston to go capture Dorchester Heights. And then while they're doing that, I'm going to have American troops massed in Cambridge to row across the Charles River and Back Bay and attack Boston. That is, he was stuck in forward gear. He felt like we had to attack, we had to attack. And that's why he was disappointed, is that the British left without being attacked, without a fight. He wanted a fight. He figured that's how you win war. But let me tell you a crucial thing about George Washington. He'd already had smallpox, so he was one of the first people who could safely enter the town. And as he went into the town, he was like this, oh my God, I can't believe how well they built up their defenses. He said every avenue fortified. That is, they were prepared. Think of Les Mis, you know, the big barricades in the streets. The British were prepared for that. And he described Boston as almost impregnable. And he didn't quite go this far, but really he realized what a terrible mistake his plan that I'm showing you on the slide here would have been. Now, this is March of 1776. He's going to spend the next 5 years of the war planning more attacks on the British in their cities, but he never carried out any of them because I think he'd learned his lesson. I can't say he dodged the bullet because Howe surprised him by leaving without a fight. In a sense, the bullet dodged him and saved him from destroying his own army. And in fact, one of his officers said, gentle providence has saved our army when we would have thrown it away. I don't remember the exact quote, but either good luck or God or somebody saved the army. And what Washington did that was so crucial was that he learned that lesson. And I'll say more about in a minute. But it's time for 1781. So let's go there. And I just want to say two brief things about 1781. First, I got to go back to my home state of South Carolina, my current home state of South Carolina, first to talk about the Battle of Cowpens, a great victory for General Daniel Morgan, but not everybody knows it was almost a terrible defeat for him because he made a really fundamental mistake. I didn't serve in the Army, but those of you who have, I think will back me up on this when we get to talking. And that is, here's the fundamental mistake he made was he fought, he had Tarleton coming up from the south attacking him, and Morgan agreed to fight Tarleton in an open field where he couldn't have those great defenses. They didn't have time to dig trenches or anything. He was basically overtaken by Tarleton, not the first American officer to be overtaken by Tarleton. And so that really could have ended in disaster for the Americans. Now, they turned it around, and that was a great victory for Morgan. But people, including Tarleton, writing his memoirs, criticized Morgan for allowing Tarleton to catch him before he could get across the Broad River. See that north of the American lines? Why the heck didn't you cross the Broad River? And here's what Morgan said. I didn't cross the Broad River because I was afraid if I did, my militia would run away. So I deliberately backed my army up against the Broad River in order to force them to fight. It was a little bit like, remember Cortez burned his boats when he was attacking the Aztecs, so his men couldn't run away. This is what Morgan's excuse for not crossing the Broad River was. No. It wasn't like I failed to, or I was moving so slowly that I allowed Tarleton to overtake me. What really happened was I made a deliberate decision to backstop my army so to force them to fight. Morgan can say, you know, people are always going to justify what they did, but here's the interesting thing about it. The Broad River, which you can see in this map in a very famous book by Commander Morris, is right behind the American lines. Now let me go to a satellite photo or an aerial photo. Down at the bottom of my map in a green circle is where the Battle of Cowpens took place. Now I'm going to go to the Broad River from, let me get my cursor. I'm going to go from the Cowpens battlefield to the Broad River. Is it right behind the American lines? I haven't even crossed over into North Carolina where the river is yet. The river is 5 miles away. And yet, the map makers read Morgan saying, I backed my men up against the broad river, and the power of Morgan saying that overcame the straight up geography, which anybody here, I hope somebody has, who like me has been to the Cowpens battlefield, has seen what I saw there. The river is nowhere near his lines. And so Morgan was BSing when he made up this line about I deliberately backed my men up against the river, because they could have easily run away. They had 5 miles of place to run away before they'd run in to the river. What really happened was that, like so many others, he'd gotten caught. What he should have done was say, oops, I made a mistake, but I turned it around and won a great victory. He couldn't admit the mistake. I don't mind that about Morgan, but if you will Google Cowpens map, you'll find that every map that I've been able to find online makes this same mistake. So that's something I'm bragging about in my book, is that we finally got the map of Cowpens straightened out by having it as a photo instead. So it'll look a little funny. It's a French map, but if you see the red splotch at the bottom, that's what was then New York City. Not even up to the modern Canal Street. It's not much more than ground zero, frankly. It was a tiny portion of Manhattan Island at the time. But you guys will remember that the British landed on that island on September 15th of 1776 and finally drove the Americans off their last holdout, Fort Washington, up where I-95 goes through now. They finally did that 2 months later in the middle of November. And from that point on, from November 1776 until the very end of the war, Washington's great obsession was capturing New York, because that was British headquarters. And he had been trained in that idea that you don't win a war unless you capture headquarters or the capital of the other side. And there was no British capital that the Americans recognized here. So he was just bent on attacking New York. I told you previously that Detroit was the great obsession of the Americans in the West. They never captured it during the Revolutionary War. The great obsession of the Americans, and Washington in particular, in the East was New York. And here too, he devised about a dozen plans to capture New York. And one of the later ones got so far as getting men on the boats rowing across. The Americans were in New Jersey. He got as far as putting the army in boats, part of it, on boats and rowing across the river. But then when they got close to the British defenses, they said nothing doing, and there was a fallback plan that he'd given them, and they went to the fallback plan of attacking up here. That is a dozen plans to attack New York, not one of which the Americans carried out. And I say, as an American myself, thank God he never carried out that attack, because capturing New York would have been even harder than capturing Boston, because it literally is an island. Here too, the British controlled the water throughout the war, and it's much of New York is surrounded by these huge, tall bluffs. In a sense, the one way I think Washington could have lost the Revolutionary War was by attacking New York, suffering a dramatic defeat that wiped out half his army, as attacking armies often did have 50% casualties. So that's not a hypothetical. That's where we could possibly imagine him losing the war. So I said he made 12 plans and didn't execute any of them. The 12th one, he really came close, because the French had just sent a giant fleet. I believe it was 27 ships of the line and a bunch of frigates, and an additional army. And he said, okay, finally I can control the water. And I've got these extra 2,000 French troops, plus a previous group of 2,000 French troops, plus my own guys. We can finally capture Detroit. And so, we can finally capture New York. And so Washington was all set to finally launched what he'd been obsessing about since 1776, his grand, kind of like D-Day, to use an anachronistic term. This was going to be his big amphibious assault on New York. But one thing stood in the way of that, and that was the French. His counterparts, Rochambeau, who was the French commander-in-chief of the army, and de Grasse, who was the admiral of that giant fleet that was on its way to America, they just overruled Washington and said, why would we hit the British, their huge headquarters army, on this heavily fortified island when we can go south instead? And we can go to Yorktown, and we can pin Cornwallis, which is with his much smaller army of only about 7,000 soldiers, we can pin them against the York River in Virginia. And Washington resisted that and resisted that. And they presented him with a fait accompli, because the message arrived that French fleet was down in the Caribbean, and the message arrived saying, we will be in Chesapeake Bay at the end of August. So if you want to battle with the British, you're going to come to where we are. Now, why did Washington not want to go to Yorktown? You'd think, hey, this is home. Why did he not want to go? Well, again, he was really obsessed with attacking the main army, and he'd been focused on New York all this time. So I think inertia was part of it. But he also had some really rational reasons for not wanting to go south. One was his soldiers were mostly from the middle states like New York and Pennsylvania, and from New England, and they had a justifiable morbid fear of tropical disease. You see, when they finally did leave was August 19th, and so it's still hot part of the summer, and it's bad enough. Your chances of catching malaria and yellow fever are bad enough in New York. It only increases when you go to the southern states. And so Washington listed among his reasons for wanting to attack the British in New York rather than in Virginia, the resistance that he expected to face. And sure enough, he'd sent Lafayette with 1,200 light infantry months earlier to kind of spar with the British in Virginia. They were hoping to capture the traitor Benedict Arnold. And Lafayette had basically a mutiny on his hand on the way south. And that was in April of 1781, before the hot weather had hit, but they knew it was coming. And so his soldiers really resisted. The women of Baltimore helped Lafayette by making new shirts for their soldiers to try to put them in a good mood. But there was real resistance on the part of these northern soldiers to going to fight in what they considered the tropics of Virginia. So he had a lot of rational reasons for not wanting to go south as well. As you know, Washington surrendered. That is, he surrendered to his French counterparts who were determined to go to Yorktown, and we're all glad they did, because Yorktown was by no means the last battle of the Revolutionary War, but it was what ended the Revolutionary War, because the capture of those 7,000 British troops convinced Parliament to cease offensive operations and begin the peace treaty process that was completed a couple of years after Yorktown in November of 1783. So that flag on the right, people go, I made this mistake on an early trip to Yorktown. Oh, that must be a surrender flag. And then someone pointed out, no, that's a French flag. And then I made the joke about, of course, the French flag would be a surrender flag. But that was unfair of me, because the Battle of Yorktown was an American victory, but it was also, if you count soldiers as well as sailors, there were twice as many Frenchmen at Yorktown than Americans. And these are French cannon aimed by French engineers. But most of all, it was the French officers, commanding officers, who commanded Washington to go to Yorktown instead of fighting the British in New York. So I've tried to throw down some provocations for you guys, and I'll be happy to scrap about some of these things, but also answer any questions that anybody
Thank you.
have.
Yeah, thanks, Woody. That's a great presentation, and I appreciate you putting so much time and effort into the slides to make those look good and help us understand things. Woody, one of the first questions here is about the west of the Appalachians. Was there a sizable loyalist population among the frontiersmen and women, or were they mostly American patriots?
Um, if you just mean the back country where settlers were just arriving, yes, there were a tremendous number of loyalists. In fact, the first battle of the Revolutionary War fought here in South Carolina, there were no British troops involved in it at all. They were loyalists fighting patriots at the first battle in which people died on either side were was in the town of 96, which was called 96 because it was 96 miles from the nearest Cherokee town. And that was from the good old days when they'd been trading with the Cherokee rather than fighting the Cherokee as they did in the Revolutionary War. So yes, there were a lot of loyalists here. And my colleague, he's now retired here at the University of South Carolina, Walter Edgar, wrote a great book called Partisans and Rebels about that. It was truly a civil war. It was more of a civil war than the Civil War, in the sense that you had many examples of brother against brother and neighborhood against neighborhood, and people you sort of who didn't even care about the war, but who had scores to settle with somebody a couple of hollers away, would use the war as a cover for brutal attacks. So yes, there were lots of loyalists in the backcountry, especially in South Carolina. I think less so in places like Pennsylvania and New York, but especially here. And let's not forget that we could debate this, but it might be fair to refer to most of the Native Americans who fought in the Revolutionary War as loyalists. That is, they were loyal to the British, but really they were loyal to their own interests. And you know, the Declaration of Independence denounces the British for stirring up the Indians against the colonists. But the reality is, as with African Americans, the initiative came from the Native Americans. They had to kind of talk the British into being in an alliance with them. So that's the case against calling them loyalists. But many more people use the term Black loyalists for the African Americans who fought on the British side. Best estimate I've seen is about 9,000 did that. And most actually the British were reluctant to use them as soldiers. You know, they had lots of slaves themselves that they wanted to keep in the Caribbean. So they were reluctant to use them as soldiers, but they played really essential roles as wagon masters and pioneers, you know, people digging trenches and things like that. And I did not mention, but want to mention briefly that roughly 9,000 African Americans in the North fought on the American side and obtained their freedom that way too. So in a sense, so there were Black loyalists, Black patriots, and in a sense, the Revolutionary War was an African American civil war because you had African Americans fighting on both sides.
Okay, a question from an old friend of yours, Dave Hogan, who gives you his regards.
Hello,
And
Dave.
he has a question about the Ohio Valley, and that traditionally we hear the story that George Rogers Clark, his expedition won the region for the United States. And his question is, did we end up with Detroit at the end of the Revolution because of those of his campaigns, even if we didn't capture it?
Yes, I think it's fair. Now, end up with is the answer to that has to be ambiguous because the British signed over Detroit. But that would be like me signing over Detroit. I can sign Detroit over to you right now, John. Here, let me get a piece of paper. Detroit is yours. Enjoy yourself. You see what I mean? It wasn't there. I mean, the fort was theirs. And so the one thing they gave over was the fort. And when did they actually give over Fort Detroit? In 1796, I think it was. So they claimed they were doing it in 1783. But the way that Dave asked the question, if you ask it as did George Rogers Clark's exploits contribute to the British decision to sign over that entire region, including Detroit, in 1783? Then I would say yes. But then, you know, people talk about in wars, as they should all the time, facts on the ground. The facts on the ground were real different from the theories on the map.
Sure. Okay. One of our audience members is interested in knowing if Washington had his troops inoculated for smallpox,
Oh, I'm
and
so
if
glad.
so, when did he do that?
I'm so glad you asked about that, because this is another example of Washington doing something that, John, Dave knows, I come from a political family. And in politics, people are always denigrating politicians who change their minds. Oh, he's a flip-flopper, is one of the biggest insults that they levy against each other. Washington flip-flopped on a bunch of key issues. And thank God that he did on the issue, as I've talked about, of feeling like he had to be on offense. The British understood from the beginning, if the Americans will just stay on defense, they will beat us. The one person who didn't get it was the commander in chief of the Americans, but he eventually got it. And in the same way, Washington changed his mind about inoculating the troops. He had a reasonable argument against it and refused. All of the doctors were pleading with him throughout 1776. We're losing so many men, especially in Canada, to smallpox. You got to inoculate the troops. And here's what's reasonable to, I personally think resisting vaccination is insane with our current virus. But here's the case against vaccination in 1777 and 1776 is that there was no cowpox. John, I think you're probably, I hope I'm not insulting you, old enough like me to have a smallpox scar. You and I were inoculated against it with the cowpox virus, but even that didn't exist in 1776. The only way you could get inoculated against smallpox was with smallpox, and it might kill you. 1 in 100 died, but it was better than getting it in the natural way, that is just from being near a person with smallpox, which killed 1 in 10 as opposed to 1 in 100. But so there's a lot of people were very suspicious of it. Washington knew he was going to have resistance from the troops. And then there was also the problem that inoculation immobilizes the people being inoculated 4 weeks. The way they did it back then, they didn't really have to do that, but they thought they had to go through this whole procedure where you drink stuff to make you throw up and to purify yourself or prepare yourself, whatever, all that stuff. And then there was the danger of, well, we can't inoculate them all on the same day. So if we inoculate them regiment by regiment, then the regiment that's just been inoculated, they are going to be contagious for a couple of weeks, and they might contaminate in the natural way, which is the real fatal way, the regiment next to them. So I'm making that too long. The point is, there were a lot of arguments against it, but the argument in favor of inoculation was that it was disproportionately killing Americans, because many of the British had already had smallpox back home because they lived in this densely populated island of England, and especially a lot of them came from London, super densely populated, where, if you make it at the age of 21 in London without dying, you've probably already had smallpox, which means you'll never get it again. So they had that for them. They'd been inoculated. And so Washington changed his mind in February of 1777 and started inoculating the army. And everything I'm telling you comes from Elizabeth Thinn's book, F-E-N-N, with a wonderful title, Pax Americana, Pax spelled with an O. And she makes a very persuasive case, at least to me, persuasive, that by inoculating his army, Washington saved his army. Another area where he changed his mind. He also changed his mind about allowing free blacks in the army. He initially threw them out, but changed his mind and let them back in.
Mm-hmm. Okay, kind of a broader question here is, and I'm kind of summarizing one and adding in another. What would you consider to have been, well, let me put it this way. If you could identify one battle or campaign or event that was the turning point in the war, after which the British really did not have a strong chance of either being able to win the war or to occupy most of the coast that they wanted to, what would you say that was? I know you said after Bunker Hill that was a significant event in the same light, but given your coverage of the military campaign in detail in the book, did you come away with any campaign or battle that you would consider a turning point, like I described?
Yes. I mean, I would say three. I mean, I want to get Bunker Hill on the map in this sense, just because I quoted Hal for brevity's sake, but Burgoyne said the same thing. Several British officers came off of Bunker Hill saying, we're going to lose this war. And as you know, you need guns and ammunition and training, but you need hope. You need belief that you can win this thing. And now it's possible that all these guys, they were just trying to create low expectations so they'd look like bigger heroes if they did win. And I'm open to that possibility, but it's amazing to read the letters of those British officers after Bunker Hill. So I do think that belongs in the three. The second one I'd mention is the obvious one of the surrender of Burgoyne on October 17th, 1777 to Gates at Saratoga. The interesting thing about that is that it makes me think of a popular song, and I'm trying to remember, is it, I'll remember who in a second, because here's the thing, the French had been supporting the Americans covertly since before the Declaration of Independence, but they hadn't been doing the really big thing of sending French battleships over here and a French army over here. And, you know, that's basically why the Declaration of Independence was written, was to try to draw the French over, and it failed at that. It succeeded in becoming a tremendous freedom document because of all men are created equal, and enslaved people actually played a big role in highlighting that phrase, and the phrase that we all now see as the iconic phrase. But we went for 2 years of failing to get the French to really commit. It was like they were dating us, but they didn't want to put a ring on it. And what got them to put a ring on it? It was Gates gets Burgoyne to surrender at Saratoga, and then the British see that and say, "Oh my God, if we don't act quickly, the French are going to come into the war." And so they started offering huge concessions to the Americans in order to get the Americans to rejoin the British Empire. And that's when the French finally put a ring on it and said, okay, well, somebody in the chat section, who sings a song about, if you like it, baby, put a ring on it. This is when the French put a ring on it, was to keep the Americans from going back to their old boyfriend, Britain. So I'd say Saratoga's number two. And the third one I'd point to, and it goes back to the question somebody asked about Loyalists in the backcountry. There were Loyalists in the backcountry, but the really pivotal battle took place also here in South Carolina, the Battle of Kings Mountain, where there were hardly any British troops. Some say even only the British commander was an actual British officer, and then everyone under him were Loyalists, mostly from New York. And on the American side, no Continentals, but all militiamen. And that was a great victory for militia. We don't want to play down the Continental Army and its crucial role, but we don't want to play down the militia either. And I think that's one reason Kings Mountain hasn't gotten its due, is that neither the Royal Army nor the Continental Army was present. It was Americans versus Americans, but it was a huge victory. That army was just wiped out, either killed or captured. Sure. And that was sort of the end of this role the British had been on in the South.
So the answer to your question was Beyonce.
Thank you very much. I don't know why I couldn't think of Beyonce. My head's in the 18th century.
I never thought our book talks would cover Beyonce, but learn something new every day. So Woody, thanks so much. We're gonna have to wrap it up here. Once again, Woody Holton, great new book. I'm glad I got it, glad I read it. And thank you very much for spending your time with us, and the audience too. Come back for more, and I hope you have a good evening.
Thanks very much. This was fun. Appreciate it.